There is a pattern in your life that you didn't choose. You meet someone. Something feels familiar, comfortable in a way that's hard to explain, safe almost, and then slowly or all at once it falls apart. And you're left wondering how you ended up here again. Not here as in this relationship, here as in this feeling. This particular brand of hurt that keeps returning, wearing different faces, speaking different names, but somehow always arriving at the same place. You've probably blamed yourself, or blamed them, or decided that people are simply like this, that love is simply like this, that this is just what intimacy costs. But what if the pattern isn't about them at all? What if the pattern is a map, drawn long before you were old enough to understand what maps were for? John Bowlby spent decades studying something most people take completely for granted, the way a child learns to attach to another human being. What he found was both simple and devastating. In the first years of life, before language, before memory as we understand it, before any conscious understanding of the world, a child's nervous system is calibrated by its primary caregivers, not by what they say, not by their intentions, but by what they do, by their consistency, their availability, their capacity to repair ruptures. The child who is held when it cries learns. The world responds. My needs matter. Other people are safe. The child who is not held or held inconsistently or held in ways that feel unpredictable or threatening learns something different, something that does not sound like a lesson because it was never spoken aloud, but it shapes everything that comes after. Bowlby called this attachment style, the deep, pre-verbal template your nervous system built for what relationships are, what they cost, what to expect from them, and most importantly, what you must do to survive them. And here is the part that should unsettle you. That template is still running, right now, in every relationship you have, in every moment of closeness that suddenly feels dangerous, in every time you pushed someone away before they could leave, in every time you held on far past the point where holding on made sense. You are not making irrational choices. You are following instructions written before you had any choice at all. There are 4 primary attachment styles that researchers have identified, and while none of them are destiny, all of them are architecture, the structure through which you experience every human connection. The first is secure attachment, the person who received consistent, attuned caregiving. They are comfortable with closeness and comfortable with distance. They can be vulnerable without fear. They can tolerate conflict without believing it means the end. They are, in the language of attachment theory, the baseline, the template that allows relationships to actually work. Most of us don't have this. The second is anxious attachment, the person who received inconsistent care, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, never reliably predictable. They learn that love is uncertain, that presence is fragile, that they must work to keep people close. They become hypervigilant to any sign of withdrawal. They interpret ambiguity as rejection. They text twice. They apologize when they've done nothing wrong. They mistake intensity for intimacy because intensity was the only proof of connection they ever had. The third is avoidant attachment, the person who learned very early that emotional needs were unwelcome, that vulnerability was weakness, that self-sufficiency was the only reliable form of safety. They become experts at independence, genuine, functional independence that can look like strength from the outside and feel like a particular kind of loneliness from the inside. They want connection. They just learn to be terrified of needing it. And the fourth, disorganized attachment, the person for whom the source of comfort was also the source of fear, the caregiver who both soothed and frightened, the person who learned that love and danger are not opposites but neighbors. These are the people most likely to find themselves in relationships that are simultaneously the best and worst experiences of their lives, who are drawn with a pull they cannot explain toward the very intensity that is most likely to hurt them. Now here is where it gets philosophically interesting, because Bowlby was describing something that the Stoics identified 2,000 years earlier, though they didn't have the language of neuroscience to name it. Epictetus wrote, "We suffer not from the events of our lives, but from our judgments about them. But there is a level of judgment that exists before conscious thought, the judgment your nervous system makes in a fraction of a second when someone goes quiet, when someone is late, when someone is warm towards you and you can't quite believe it, when someone pulls away and something inside you, not your rational mind, but something older and more urgent, interprets that distance as evidence of your unworthiness. Those are not rational judgments. They are attachment judgments, and they have enormous power. precisely because they feel like reality rather than interpretation. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private meditations, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Your attachment wounds are not impediments to love. They are the specific terrain through which your capacity for love is asking to develop. But first, you have to see them. James Bowlby's student, the researcher, Mary Ainsworth, conducted what became one of the most famous experiments in psychology, the strange situation study. She observed what happened when a child's primary caregiver briefly left the room and then returned. The securely attached child protested the separation, sought comfort on return, was soothed and resumed playing, a complete emotional cycle. The anxiously attached child was inconsolable, both during the separation and upon return, unable to be soothed, unable to trust that the comfort being offered was real or would last. The avoidantly attached child seemed unbothered, barely registered the departure, barely registered the return. But underneath that apparent indifference, their physiological measures showed the same levels of stress as the anxious children. They had simply learned to suppress the external signal, while the internal alarm kept sounding. This is the most important thing Ainsworth found. The child who appears fine is not fine. They have simply learned that showing distress doesn't help. And this matters because so many of us are that child, grown into adults who believe they have resolved, processed, moved past something that they have simply learned not to show. The suppression is not healing. It is a strategy, and strategies are not forever. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Your attachment pattern is one of the deepest forms of unconscious direction there is. You don't decide to be drawn to emotionally unavailable people. You don't decide to leave exactly when something good is becoming real. You don't decide to test the people you love most in the ways most likely to drive them away. The decision was made for you by a child who had no other options. And here is what Jung understood that goes beyond Bowlby's framework. The attachment wound is not just a relational problem. It is an identity problem, because the conclusion a child draws from insecure attachment is not merely, other people are unreliable. It is, I am the kind of person to whom unreliable things happen. I am the kind of person who is not worth consistent love. I am the kind of person who must earn or suppress or perform in order to deserve connection. The wound doesn't just live in how you relate to others. It lives in how you relate to yourself. And that is why changing your attachment style is not simply about finding better partners. It is about fundamentally revising the story you have been telling about who you are and what you deserve. Viktor Frankl observed something in the concentration camps that is relevant here in a way that might initially seem strange. He noticed that the people who survived the unsurvivable were not necessarily the strongest or the most resourceful. They were the ones who maintained what he called freedom of attitude, the capacity to choose their response to even the most uncontrollable circumstances. And he wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom, the space between stimulus and response. When someone you love goes quiet, that is the stimulus. The pain, the panic, the certainty that something terrible is happening, that is the response. Between them, most of the time, there is no space at all. The response arrives before conscious thought, before choice. Healing attachment wounds is not about eliminating the response. It is about creating the space, about developing the capacity to notice something in me just interpreted that silence as abandonment before acting on that interpretation as if it were fact. This is extraordinarily difficult. It is the work of years, not insights. It requires what psychologists call earned security, the slow, effortful construction of a felt sense of safety that wasn't given to you early enough to be automatic. But it is possible, not because you can rewrite the past, but because the nervous system, it turns out, remains plastic far longer than we once believed. New experiences of being safely held, in therapy, in friendship, in the gradual accumulation of moments where the feared catastrophe doesn't happen, can lay down new tracks alongside the old ones. You don't erase the wound. You build something alongside it that is stronger. The philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote about what he called thrownness, the condition of finding yourself already in a world you didn't choose, with a history you didn't author, in a body and a family and a culture that shaped you before you had any say in the matter. You were thrown into a particular family. into a particular set of relational experiences, into an attachment style you had no hand in constructing. But Heidegger also wrote about projection, not in the psychological sense, but in the sense of reaching forward, of orienting yourself toward a possibility that doesn't yet exist. You are thrown, and you are also always projecting, moving towards something, even when you don't know what it is. The question attachment theory ultimately asks is not what happened to you. The question is, what will you do with what happened to you? Not through willpower, not through deciding to simply be different, but through the slow, patient, often painful work of understanding what was built inside you, and then, gradually, building something new alongside it. The psychologist Daniel Siegel describes what he calls the narrative of the self, the story we tell about our lives that makes sense of our experience. He found something remarkable in his research. The single strongest predictor of a child's attachment security was not what happened to their parents in childhood. It was whether their parents had made sense of what happened to them. Not whether they had perfect childhoods, not whether they were free of wounds, whether they had looked at the wounds clearly enough to understand them. This means that the work you do now, the looking, the naming, the willingness to understand the architecture of your own pain, doesn't just change you, it changes what you pass on. The pattern that was given to you without your consent can end with you, not through force, not through willpower, but through the radical act of understanding. There is a letter Rilke wrote to a young man struggling with questions about love. He said, "For one human being to love another, that is perhaps the most difficult of all our tasks, the ultimate, the last test and proof, the work for which all other work is but preparation. The most difficult of all our tasks, not despite our attachment wounds, but perhaps in part because of them, because the wound is also the location of the longing. The place where the need is most acute is also the place where the capacity is most waiting to be developed. You keep attracting the wrong people, or pushing away the right ones, or finding yourself in the same feeling again, wearing a different face. This is not evidence that you are broken. This is your nervous system trying to finish something that was left unfinished. The question is not whether you can stop the pattern. You cannot stop it by deciding to stop it. The question is whether you are willing to understand it clearly enough that it begins to lose its automatic power. Whether you are willing to create just enough space between the stimulus and the response to choose something different. That space is where freedom lives, and it has always been there, waiting. Think about it.